Hollywood was built on light, but it has always been the darkness that writes its best stories. In the city of fame, the brave rarely live long. They were singers, actors, comedians, and dreamers, people whose only mistake was saying no to the wrong men. In an age when silence was safer than truth, these 10 refused to bow. And in Hollywood, defiance always comes with a price. The mob didn't just own the streets of Las Vegas or the back rooms of Chicago. It owned contracts. It owned careers. It owned fear. The studios and the syndicates had a silent handshake, one that traded safety for obedience. Those who accepted it became stars. Those who resisted became stories whispered in dressing rooms long after their deaths. They thought they were free. They thought talent could protect them. But in a town where money speaks louder than conscience, freedom was just another illusion sold on a studio lot. Some of these names you'll recognize. Legends who once smiled from magazine covers, their fame as bright as the spotlights that later burned them out. Others you've never heard of, because someone made sure of that. Their fates were written not by the public, not by critics, but by men who sat in smoke-filled rooms, deciding who lived, who fell, and who simply vanished. Sal Mineo, Joey Lewis, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Phyllis McGuire. 5 stories of courage and 5 reminders that even the loudest voices can be silenced when they challenge the wrong gods. The first of them was a rebel, a young man who carried James Dean's fire, but none of his protection. He saw too much, spoke too honestly, and paid for it outside his own front door. His name was Sal Mineo, and his death was no accident. Sal Mineo, the rebel who knew too much. He was born with eyes that seemed to belong to someone twice his age, deep, alert, and quietly wounded. Sal Mineo never looked like he fit in, and maybe that was why the camera loved him. By the time he was 16, he was already a Broadway veteran. By 20, he was nominated for an Academy Award for Rebel Without a Cause. He didn't just act the role of a lost boy, he was one. Hollywood called him the next James Dean, but the town only loved its rebels when they stayed on the screen. Off camera, Sal was something the studios didn't know how to control. Outspoken, passionate, and unafraid to confront the truth behind the dream factory. In the 1960s, he started asking questions no one else dared to. Why did so many stars vanish without explanation? Why did union bosses, supposedly protecting artists, answer to men in Chicago instead of Los Angeles? Why did everyone in power seem afraid of someone else, someone unseen? It wasn't paranoia. Sal had begun seeing the underworld up close. Not in the streets, but in the shadows behind the lights. He was part of the underground circles that connected Hollywood's gay community. A secret world filled with fear, blackmail, and the quiet influence of organized crime. The mob saw opportunity where others saw shame. They controlled the bars, the parties, the silence. And Sal, brave or naive, refused to be silent. He spoke out about corruption in Hollywood unions and hinted that powerful men, some with mob ties, were exploiting vulnerable actors. Those words made him dangerous. By the early 1970s, his career was slipping. Studios stopped calling. His name vanished from the casting sheets. But still he talked. He told friends he was working on something big, a story about the darker side of fame, about people who were being used and thrown away. Then came February 12th, 1976. It was late when Sal finished rehearsing for his new play. He was tired but content, finally rebuilding his life on his own terms. He parked his car outside his apartment on Holloway Drive, West Hollywood. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. As he stepped out of the car, someone approached from behind. A flash of silver, a single motion, a blade plunged deep into his chest. Sal collapsed against his car, gasping for breath. When neighbors found him moments later, he was still alive, but barely. He whispered, "Oh God," before the world faded out. The police called it a random mugging, but nothing about it was random. His wallet was untouched, his watch still on his wrist. And the supposed mugger? A drifter with no ties, or so the official report claimed. For those who knew Sal, the truth was much colder. He had been warned to stop talking. He didn't. And in Hollywood, that's all it takes. After his death, a few people tried to keep his name alive, but the town moved on quickly. No one wanted to believe the mob still had reach in the 1970s, or that a young actor's death could be anything but coincidence. It was easier to call it tragic, not targeted. But Sal Mineo had seen behind the curtain. He had glimpsed the machine that ran the dream, and for that, he became one more forgotten casualty in the city of illusions. He once said in an interview, "You can't survive this business if you're too honest." He was right. And that honesty, the one thing that made him real, is what got him killed. Sal Mineo stood up to the darkness, and the darkness made sure he stayed silent. Joey Lewis, the comedian who wouldn't obey, long before the mob discovered Hollywood, it owned the nightclubs. And in those dim rooms full of smoke and jazz, Joey Lewis was a star. He wasn't just funny, he was magnetic. When Joe stepped on stage, gangsters stopped talking and women forgot to breathe. He could make the most dangerous men in Chicago laugh until they cried. That was his gift and his curse. By the late 1920s, Joe had become the crown jewel of the Green Mill Club, a mob-owned speakeasy run by Machine Gun Jack McGuire, one of Al Capone's most ruthless lieutenants. McGuire adored Joe. He saw him as property. And like all property in that world, Joe was expected to stay loyal. But Joe wanted freedom. He wanted to choose his own stage, his own audience, his own future. When a rival club offered him a better deal, Joe said yes and walked away. No one walked away from Jack McGuire. A week later, on a cold November morning in 1927, Joe returned to his hotel room after a show. The hallway was quiet, the air heavy with rain. As he reached for his door, he heard footsteps behind him. The men moved fast. They dragged him inside, beat him until his bones cracked, and then held him down. One of them whispered, "You should have stayed where you belonged." Then they cut his throat from ear to ear. He should have died that night. But somehow Joey Lewis lived. When the bellboy found him hours later, bleeding but breathing, he was rushed to the hospital. Doctors said he'd never speak again. The mob thought they'd silenced him forever. They were wrong. Months passed. Joe taught himself to talk again. One word at a time, each syllable a victory. His voice was rough, broken, scarred. But his sense of humor survived untouched. When he finally returned to the stage, the audience wept before he spoke a word. And when he did, the first thing he said was, "You should hear me sing." The room exploded in laughter. That was Joe, fearless even in the face of death. He refused to name his attackers, even when everyone knew who they were. Reporters asked why he stayed quiet. He just smiled and said, "I don't want to lose my sense of humor again." For years, he kept performing, often in mob-run clubs. He'd stand under the spotlight, making jokes about death, while the men who tried to kill him sat in the front row applauding. It was a strange kind of revenge, the laughter of a man who couldn't be broken. But the price of survival was isolation. Joe drank heavily, haunted by nightmares of that night. He never fully recovered, physically or emotionally. Still, he became a legend, the comedian who lived when the mob wanted him dead. Frank Sinatra later immortalized him in the 1957 film The Joker is Wild, playing Joe's story as both tragedy and triumph. When Sinatra asked Joe if the movie got it right, he said, "Almost. You forgot how scared I was." Joey Lewis died in 1971, alone in his apartment, a bottle of gin beside him. He had spent a lifetime making others laugh, but the sound never reached the place where the pain lived. Still, his defiance survived. In every punchline, every crooked smile, every night he stood under the lights, knowing the men who once tried to kill him were listening. He had learned the truth that so many others never did. You can survive the mob. You just can't escape it. Joey Lewis didn't just fight the mob, he humiliated them, one laugh at a time. Frank Sinatra, the voice who walked away. In the 1950s, Frank Sinatra was more than a singer, he was America's voice. That voice could command a room, charm presidents, and calm the chaos of a generation still healing from war. But beneath the spotlight, his story was never just about fame. It was about survival. in a world where every song had a price and every friend could be a trap. Sinatra was born into the noise of New Jersey, a street kid with ambition and attitude. He didn't come from money, he came from fight. And when fame found him, the mob was already waiting. In the 1940s and 1950s, no entertainer rose without a patron, and in Frank's case, that patron was Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss who ruled Las Vegas from behind the velvet curtains. Giancana loved Sinatra, his talent, his confidence, his connections. Through Giancana's influence, Sinatra got prime shows in mob-owned casinos, lucrative movie deals, and favored treatment from studio executives who owed the outfit more than they'd ever admit. For a while it worked. The mob had their voice, and Frank had his throne. He was untouchable, or so he thought. But Sinatra was no fool. He knew how power worked, and he didn't like being owned. Behind the charm and tuxedo was a man who understood that every favor came with a chain attached. It started small, requests for introductions, private meetings with politicians, whispers about certain campaign donations that needed to pass through his hands. And then, the White House. When Sinatra introduced Giancana to John F. Kennedy through their shared connection, Judith Campbell, he thought he was strengthening friendships. Instead, he was walking into a political storm. As the FBI intensified surveillance on organized crime, Sinatra found himself caught in the crossfire. The same government he'd supported now saw him as a liability. His phone was tapped, his friends interrogated, his reputation bleeding in the press. And Giancana, the man who had once called him brother, saw it as betrayal. When Kennedy cut ties with Sinatra to distance himself from scandal, the mob's patience snapped. The favors stopped. The protection vanished. And suddenly, the man with the golden voice was standing on stage alone, wondering which handshake had marked his fall. In those years, Sinatra's temper became legend. He lashed out at reporters, at photographers, even at his own shadow. But deep down, the rage was fear. He had seen too much, owed too many, and trusted too few. Rumors spread that there was a hit out on him, that Giancana wanted him taught a lesson. Nothing was ever proven. But Frank never slept the same again. He left the casino circuit, distanced himself from old friends, and poured his pain into his music. Every lyric, "That's life, my way, it was a very good year," sounded less like confidence and more like confession. "Regrets, I've had a few," but those who listened closely knew. He wasn't singing about women or fame. He was singing about power and what it had cost him. By the time Giancana was found dead in 1975, shot 7 times in his own kitchen, Sinatra's name was nowhere near the investigation. He never spoke publicly about his mob ties again. But whenever someone asked about Sam, he would pause, smile faintly, and change the subject. Because some ghosts are better left undisturbed. Frank Sinatra died a legend, loved by millions, feared by a few, and haunted by the kind of memories that no applause can drown out. He walked away from the mob, but he carried its shadow to his grave. He sang for presidents and criminals alike, and in the end, the applause sounded the same. Dean Martin, the Rat Pack rebel. If Frank Sinatra was the storm, Dean Martin was the calm that followed. Smooth, effortless, untouchable. He was the kind of man who never seemed afraid of anything. To the public, he was the king of cool. That lazy grin, a cigarette dangling from his lips, a glass of whiskey always half full. But Dean's secret was simple. The whiskey was fake, and the smile was armor. Behind the charm and the laughter, Martin was a man who had seen the cost of getting too close to the mob and had decided he wanted out. In the golden years of Las Vegas, the Rat Pack ruled the Strip. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Dean Martin. 5 men who could turn a casino into a circus and make the whole country laugh. But it wasn't just show business. Behind the curtains stood men like Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo, watching every move, counting every dollar. The Rat Pack wasn't just entertainment, it was business. And business in Vegas always meant the mob. Dean had joined the Rat Pack after years of grinding through Hollywood's toughest circuits. Nightclub shows, B-movies, endless road gigs. When the Rat Pack exploded, he became a legend overnight. But where Sinatra leaned into power, Dean preferred peace. He didn't like the mob, didn't trust politicians, and hated owing anyone anything. At first, Giancana saw him as an ally, the cool one, the level-headed one. But Dean didn't play the game. He refused favors, ignored invitations to private meetings, and declined to get involved in deals that smelled dirty. When Giancana's men offered him extra protection during shows, Dean famously told them, "If they shoot me, shoot them back. Otherwise, don't bother me." It was charm masking defiance, and the mob didn't take kindly to defiance. Over time, the cracks in the Rat Pack began to show. Frank's temper, Lawford's political scandals, Sammy's complicated relationships, and through it all, Dean's quiet resistance. He showed up late, left early, and refused to take part in Mafia-sponsored appearances. When asked why, he said, "Because I don't like being told what to sing or who to sing for." That was enough to make him a problem. Rumors began spreading that Dean was disrespecting friends, that he was forgetting who made him. But Martin never flinched. He simply smiled, raised his glass, and went home. When the mob realized he couldn't be intimidated, they switched tactics. They froze him out. Casinos where he used to headline quietly stopped booking him. Film offers slowed. Even Sinatra, caught between loyalty and fear, started keeping his distance. To outsiders, it looked like Dean Martin was fading. But in truth, he was doing what no one else had dared. He was walking away. He retreated from Hollywood's chaos and built his own world. Golf, family, and silence. He sang when he wanted to, where he wanted to. And when asked why he had left it all behind, he said, "I'd rather be bored than buried." By the 1980s, the Rat Pack was gone, the mob was fractured, and Dean had become a relic of a more glamorous and more dangerous time. He rarely spoke about the men who had once surrounded him. He didn't need to. His silence was his victory. Dean Martin died peacefully in 1995, in his own bed, something almost no one from his era could claim. But peace came with a price. He spent his last years alone, haunted by memories of the friends he'd buried and the ones he'd left behind. In a business where everyone owed someone, Dean Martin owed no one. He didn't fight the mob with guns or words. He fought it by doing the one thing it couldn't forgive. He ignored it. In a world built on favors and fear, Dean Martin's quiet rebellion was the loudest sound of all. Phyllis McGuire, the woman who loved a mob boss. She had the kind of beauty the camera adored. Perfect posture, angelic smile, a voice smooth as champagne. To America, Phyllis McGuire was one-third of the McGuire sisters, the wholesome singing trio that defined the 1950s. They were elegance, purity, and family charm, the very image of what Hollywood wanted women to be. But behind that polished smile, Phyllis was living a love story that could never make the front page, because the man who held her heart was the most dangerous figure in America. His name was Sam Giancana. By the time Phyllis met him, Giancana was already a legend. The Chicago outfit boss who controlled Las Vegas casinos, rigged elections, and, according to FBI whispers, had connections that reached as far as the White House. He was ruthless, powerful, and magnetic. To the outside world, he was a monster. To Phyllis, he was a mystery she couldn't resist. They met at a private event in Las Vegas in 1959. He sent her roses the next morning, a dozen for her beauty and one more for luck. Soon after, she was seen stepping out of limousines that didn't belong to any Hollywood studio. Their romance was intoxicating. He'd fly her across the country in private jets, shower her with jewels, promise her the world. For a girl raised in conservative Ohio, it was a dream dipped in danger. And like all dreams born in the shadows, it came with a cost. The FBI knew. They wiretapped their phones, photographed their meetings, tracked her every move. She became a liability, not just to Giancana, but to an entire network of men who depended on silence. When reporters began circling, Giancana told her to disappear for a while. She refused. "You can't scare me," she once said to him. "I've already lost the right to be afraid." But she was wrong. Fear wasn't something you lost. It was something you learned to live with. Soon the gossip columns turned cruel. The McGuire sisters' clean image shattered. Concert bookings vanished overnight. The trio disbanded, their golden harmonies silenced by association. Phyllis became a ghost of her former self. Glamorous but exiled, living in a mansion in Las Vegas that Giancana had bought for her, she filled it with mirrors and chandeliers, as if trying to reflect a world that no longer existed. In 1965, Giancana's empire began to crumble. He was called before a federal grand jury in order to testify. He refused and was sent to prison. When he was released, he found his kingdom gone, his allies scattered, and his enemies closing in. Phyllis tried to distance herself, but love doesn't always let go. Even after Giancana's assassination in 1975, 7 bullets to the head in his own kitchen, his ghost lingered in her life. The FBI raided her home, still suspecting she knew more than she ever admitted. She smiled for the cameras, denying everything, repeating the same lines she'd used for years. "I loved him. That's all there is." But everyone in that world knew. Love was never all there is. Phyllis McGuire lived until 2020, long after every man who had once defined her life was gone. She never married, never had children, and never escaped the shadow of that affair. In her final interview, when asked about Giancana, she still defended him. "He was kind to me," she said softly, "and that's the truth I'll keep." Maybe she believed it. Maybe she needed to. Because for Phyllis, like so many before her, the mob wasn't just a force of fear. It was the closest thing she ever had to passion. She had fought for love, not realizing she was fighting the one war no one ever wins. "She didn't die for the mob," the narrator would whisper, "but she lived for it." And that was worse. They stood up. They spoke out. Some for truth, others for love. But the result was always the same. The mob took everything it couldn't control. Dino Bravo, the athlete who betrayed the system. He was a hero to millions. A mountain of muscle, the pride of Quebec, the man who could lift giants above his head and smile while doing it. But in the end, Dino Bravo couldn't lift the one weight that crushed everyone who ever worked for the mob: debt. In the 1980s, professional wrestling was spectacle, bright lights, roaring crowds, and men who looked immortal. But behind the curtain, the business was chaos. Bad contracts, hidden money, and powerful people pulling strings far from the ring. When Dino's fame began to fade, so did his fortune. The crowd still cheered, but the checks stopped coming. And in Montreal, when you needed fast money, there was only one place to find it: the mob. At first, it was small favors, deliveries, introductions, the kind of side work everyone said was harmless. But soon Dino was neck-deep in a black market cigarette operation that stretched from Quebec to New York. Millions in profits, millions in risks. The men he worked with were polite at first, then they weren't. They wanted control. They wanted loyalty. And Dino Bravo, the national hero, the family man the face kids recognized from television, thought he could outsmart them. He couldn't. On the night of March 10th, 1993, Dino was home alone. His wife and daughter were out. He was sitting in his armchair, watching TV. Hockey, his favorite. When the knock came, he didn't hesitate. He knew the faces at the door. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. A moment later, neighbors heard gunfire. Sharp, fast, relentless. 17 shots to the head and chest. When his wife came home, she found him still in the chair, the television still on. The show kept playing, as if nothing had happened. Police called it a professional hit. Everyone knew why. Dino Bravo had tried to break free from the smuggling ring. He'd argued over profits, talked too loudly, trusted the wrong people. The mob doesn't give second chances. He had gone from national icon to body in a crime scene. Proof that no amount of fame could outshine the shadows he'd stepped into. For fans, it was unthinkable. The hero of the ring, murdered like a criminal. For those who knew the underworld, it was inevitable. Because in the mob's world, you don't retire. You just stop breathing. In the months that followed, whispers filled Montreal's streets. Names were mentioned, then withdrawn. No one was ever charged. No one ever will be. The ring lights dimmed. The cheers stopped. But the lesson remained. He fought for glory in front of millions. But in the end, his last fight was in silence. Salvatore Bonanno, the son who refused his father's throne. He was born into power, not earned, not chosen, but inherited like a curse. Salvatore Bill Bonanno came into the world with a last name that meant fear. His father, Joseph Bonanno, was one of the original godfathers of the American Mafia, the man who helped design the Commission, the criminal government that ruled New York's underworld for decades. To the world, Joe Bonanno was a gentleman, always well-dressed, polite, the kind of man who kissed your cheek before he ruined your life. To his son, he was a god. Salvatore grew up surrounded by whispers, men in suits who came and went, conversations that ended when he entered the room, and rules that made no sense to a child. He was told never to ask questions, never to trust outsiders, and above all, never to say the family's name too loudly. But as he grew older, the silence began to suffocate him. In the 1960s, when most young men were rebelling through music and protest, Salvatore Bonanno rebelled by refusing his inheritance. He didn't want to be a Don. He wanted to be free. The problem was, the Mafia doesn't believe in freedom. When Joe Bonanno tried to pass his empire to his son, the other families saw it as an insult. They didn't trust Salvatore, too educated, too soft, too American. And they were right about one thing. He wasn't like them. He believed the life his father built was collapsing under its own corruption. He wanted to end the violence, to turn the empire into something legitimate. To them, that was treason. And so began the Banana War, a bloody internal conflict that left dozens dead and nearly wiped out the Bonanno family entirely, all because one son dared to say no. In the aftermath, Salvatore fled. His family exiled him for safety, though everyone knew what that meant. He lived under constant surveillance, from the FBI, from rival families, and from his own blood. He once said in an interview, "I was born into a war that started before I took my first breath." He tried to build a new life, went to college, married, even wrote books about his family, but the shadows never left. Every attempt to tell the truth was met with quiet threats, mysterious car accidents, and phone calls that ended in silence. When his memoir Bound by Honor was released, many saw it as a betrayal, an act of war against the Code of Omerta, the vow of silence that kept the Mafia alive. The message from the old guard was clear: you don't get to rewrite the story. Salvatore ignored them, or pretended to. He gave interviews, appeared on talk shows, and spoke about the need for the Mafia to evolve. But each appearance came with a cost. He was no longer welcome in his father's world, nor fully accepted by the one outside it. He lived between two worlds, too mobbed to be innocent, too honest to be trusted. In his final years, Salvatore Bonanno retreated into quiet isolation. He rarely appeared in public. He knew too much to be safe and too proud to stay silent. When he died in 2008, the obituaries were polite, restrained, as if everyone still feared to write his name. No scandal, no violence, just a man quietly fading from the legacy he once tried to destroy. But in truth, his death was the final act of rebellion. He had done the one thing no Bonanno had ever done before him. He refused to inherit the throne. He was born into power, but died as a man. And in the world he came from, that was the greatest defiance of all. Bugsy Siegel, the visionary who defied his partners. Before Las Vegas was neon and noise, before the casinos owned the desert, there was Bugsy Siegel, a man who dreamed of turning sand into gold. He was handsome, magnetic, reckless, the kind of man who could charm a movie star and terrify a mob boss in the same breath. Born Benjamin Siegel in Brooklyn, he grew up running numbers and stealing cars, a street kid who believed he was destined for something bigger. And he was right, just not in the way he imagined. Bugsy wasn't like the other gangsters of his time. He didn't hide in shadows. He dressed in silk, mingled with movie stars, and moved through Hollywood like he owned it. To him, crime wasn't about power, it was about style. But style has a price. And Bugsy's life was about to prove that beauty and brutality often come hand in hand. In the 1930s, Siegel became a founding member of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the American Mafia. The men who made death a business. But Bugsy was different. He wanted out of the blood and into something bigger. He looked west, to California, to Hollywood, to opportunity. When he arrived, he was everything Los Angeles adored. Handsome, charming, dangerous. He partied with Clark Gable, gambled with studio heads, and dined with the most powerful producers in town. He called it the show business of crime. Hollywood called him irresistible. He invested in nightclubs, film studios, and casinos. He dated starlets and married into wealth. And then he met Virginia Hill, the woman who matched his fire and shared his appetite for danger. Together they became the underworld's golden couple, beauty and blood, wrapped in mink and diamonds. But while Bugsy was chasing love, he was also chasing an empire. He wanted to build the first luxury casino in Las Vegas, a paradise in the desert, a place where the rich would come to sin without shame. He called it the Flamingo. It was bold, it was visionary, it was madness. He poured millions into the project, mob money most of it, and kept spending. Costs tripled, then quadrupled. Rumors spread that Siegel was skimming profits, stealing from the very men who had bankrolled his dream. He denied it. They didn't believe him. When the Flamingo finally opened in 1946, it was a disaster. Rain poured, the power failed, the guests never came. The mob wanted answers. Siegel promised he'd fix it, and somehow he did. The casino eventually turned a profit, but it was too late. The bosses had already lost faith. On June 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel sat in the Virginia Hills Beverly Hills mansion, reading the evening paper. He looked relaxed, almost peaceful. Outside, the air was still. Through the open window, a rifle waited. At exactly 10:45 p.m., gunfire shattered the glass. 9 bullets tore through the room. 2 struck Bugsy, 1 in the head, 1 in the chest. He died instantly. The headlines called it a gangland execution. The mob called it business. And Hollywood, the city that had once adored him, pretended it never knew him at all. When police arrived, Virginia Hill was gone. She would later claim she'd been in Europe. A convenient alibi, one no one ever believed. Some say she'd been warned, told to leave before the hit. Others believed she'd helped arrange it. But the truth, like the money, vanished. The Flamingo continued to grow, becoming the crown jewel of Las Vegas, the monument to Bugsy's madness. The men who killed him made millions off his vision. His death was both the end of one era and the beginning of another. The mob had proven that even its dreamers could die for dreaming too much. He built Las Vegas with blood and imagination. He believed he could make crime beautiful. And the mob reminded him, beauty doesn't last. Virginia Hill, the queen who knew too much. She was called the Queen of the Mob, but Virginia Hill never saw herself that way. She wasn't a gangster or a killer or a conspirator. She was something more dangerous, a woman who knew too much. Before she was draped in mink and diamonds, she was just a poor girl from Alabama who wanted more than the world was willing to give. She was clever, ambitious, and unafraid to take what she wanted. And when she met the Mafia met its match. By her early 20s, Virginia had become a courier for the Chicago outfit, running money, information, and sometimes people across borders. She learned the rules fast. Smile, keep quiet, and always leave before the police arrive. She wasn't just beautiful, she was invaluable. The mob trusted her because she didn't flinch. The men feared her because she didn't need them. Then came Bugsy Siegel, the man who would turn her ambition into obsession. They met in 1942 at a Beverly Hills party that smelled of champagne and danger. Bugsy was magnetic, loud, impossible to ignore. Virginia was sharp, calculating, unimpressed. He called her Flame. She called him crazy. Within months, they were inseparable. 2 storms colliding under Hollywood's neon glow. She watched him dream of Las Vegas, watched him build the Flamingo, watched him risk everything to create something beautiful. But when the bullets came for him in 1947, she learned the hardest truth of all. The mob doesn't build dreams, it buries them. After Bugsy's death, Virginia became the woman everyone whispered about, the lover, the accomplice, the traitor. The FBI followed her every move, convinced she knew where the money went and who had given the order to kill him. She denied everything. She always did. She told investigators, "I was just a woman who loved the wrong man." But she wasn't fooling anyone. Virginia had been in the room when deals were made, when lives were ended, when fortunes changed hands. She had seen the mob from the inside, and she had lived to tell the tale. That made her dangerous. In the years that followed, Virginia's life became a slow-motion collapse. Her fame faded. Her friends disappeared. The men who had once called her darling now called her a liability. By the 1950s, she fled America altogether, settling in Europe, first in Italy, then in Austria. She said she wanted peace. What she found was exile. She lived in a quiet house in Salzburg, far from the lights of Vegas and the glamour of Hollywood. Neighbors described her as polite, elegant, lonely. She was often seen walking her dog alone, her hair pinned perfectly, her lipstick always red. But her eyes, they said, looked like someone waiting for something that would never come. The FBI still sent agents to question her. Reporters still tried to find her. And the mob, well, the mob never forgot. On March 24, 1966, Virginia Hill was found dead in her home. A bottle of pills beside the bed. The official report said suicide. The locals said coincidence. And the men who once owned her silence said nothing at all. She was 49. No funeral, no mourners. Just a quiet burial in an Austrian cemetery under a thin blanket of snow. They said she killed herself because of money troubles. Others whispered she had been silenced, that she had tried one last time to sell what she knew. No one ever proved it. No one ever will. But those who studied her story knew this much. Virginia Hill survived the mob longer than any of them expected, and that in their world was reason enough to die. She wasn't a gangster. She wasn't innocent either. She was something far more dangerous, a woman who knew the truth. Mickey Cohen, the gangster who turned against his own. By the time the rest of the country thought the mob was fading, Mickey Cohen was proof it wasn't. He wasn't Italian, wasn't born into a family of dons. He was a street fighter from Brooklyn who clawed his way into power with nothing but fists, charm, and rage. And for a brief, violent moment, he ruled Los Angeles. But unlike the others, Mickey didn't stay loyal. He played by his own rules. And that made him the most dangerous kind of outlaw, an independent one. He started small, a teenage boxer, light on his feet and quick with a grin. When boxing didn't pay, crime did. By his 20s, he was running bets for Bugsy Siegel, the same man who brought Hollywood under the mob's shadow. Mickey idolized him, the clothes, the cars, the fear he commanded just by walking into a room. But after Bugsy's murder in 1947, something in Mickey snapped. He didn't just lose a mentor, he lost faith in the system that killed him. And in the mob, losing faith is the first step toward death. Mickey built his own empire, the Cohen Syndicate. He controlled gambling, drugs, prostitution, and even Hollywood's loan sharks. He ran Los Angeles like a mayor without an office. Everyone who mattered knew his name. Producers, actors, cops, and politicians. They smiled for the cameras, but when Mickey called, they answered. He was violent, unpredictable, and proud of it. He bragged to reporters that he kept order in LA. When a rival crew tried to muscle in, he sent his men to make an example. 12 bullets into a Beverly Hills driveway. And when someone asked if he feared prison, he grinned and said, "Prison? That's just where they send you when you run out of friends." But Mickey's greatest enemy wasn't the mob or the law. It was his own mouth. He loved the spotlight too much. Loved the reporters, the photographers, the women who wanted to be near danger without getting burned. He gave interviews, wrote columns, even posed for Life magazine. He turned himself into a celebrity criminal, the Hollywood version of a gangster, and the mob hated him for it. He broke omerta, not by confessing crimes, but by enjoying fame. To the bosses back east, he was a clown. To the FBI, he was a gold mine. The walls began to close in. Federal agents raided his casinos, his homes, even his tailor shop. They couldn't prove murder, but they could prove something worse in the mob's world. Tax evasion. And in 1951, Mickey Cohen was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He thought it would end there. He was wrong. In 1961, while serving a second sentence at Alcatraz, he was ambushed in the shower by another inmate, a hitman with a steel pipe hidden in a towel. They beat him so badly he never fully recovered. The message was clear. The mob hadn't forgiven him. He'd become an embarrassment, a loudmouth, a reminder that no one was bigger than the code. When he was finally released, he was a different man. Half-crippled, paranoid, sleeping with the lights on. Still, he couldn't resist the fame. He gave interviews about mob life, wrote books, and even sold his story to Hollywood. But every word he spoke was another nail in his coffin. By the 1970s, Mickey Cohen was a ghost haunting the city he once ruled. The new generation didn't fear him. They pitied him. The casinos had gone corporate. The mob had gone silent. And Mickey, the man who'd once bragged about running Los Angeles, was living in a cheap apartment, counting old newspaper clippings as if they were trophies. He died in 1976 of stomach cancer, alone, with no visitors. The press called him the last gangster of Hollywood. But the mob never mentioned his name again. He fought his own bosses. He laughed in the face of power. And in the end, the only empire he ruled was his own memory. The Price of Defiance. The mob didn't just kill for money, it killed for silence, for obedience, for control. 10 stars, 10 rebels. Each thought courage could rewrite the rules. But Hollywood's shadow never forgets. Some died in alleys, some in mansions. All of them paid. The lights of old Hollywood have faded, but its ghosts remain. In the whispers, the contracts, and the stories we're still too afraid to tell.